My name is Joelle Tremblay, and I've been a licensed electrician for 9 years. I want to be clear about something before I say anything else. I didn't fall into this work by accident. I chose it. I did 2 years at NATE, passed my red seal on the first attempt, and spent the next several years working my way from apprentice to journey person to, eventually, running my own crew on commercial and industrial sites across Alberta. I pay taxes on a six-figure income. I own my condo in Edmonton outright. I have a pension, a truck that doesn't break down, and calluses on my hands that I've stopped trying to hide with lotion. I say all of this not to brag. I say it because for a long time my brother made me feel like none of it counted. His name is Kevin. He's 32, 2 years younger than me, and he works in marketing for a downtown Calgary firm. He wears slim fit. He uses the word optics unironically. When we were growing up, our parents talked about his future in the careful, reverent way that people talk about something precious and fragile. When they talked about mine, they used the word practical. As in, Joelle is very practical. As in, it's good to have options. As in, at least she'll always find work. I learned early that practical was a compliment dressed up to feel like a consolation prize. For most of my adult life, I let it go. I went to Christmas dinners. I smiled when Kevin talked about his campaigns and his quarterly reviews and his team-building retreats in Banff. I didn't bring up the fact that my last project was a 22,000 square foot distribution facility in Nisku. Or that I'd just taken on my first subcontract worth more than I'd made in my first 3 years combined. I didn't bring it up because nobody asked. And after a while, you stop volunteering information that nobody seems to want. The call came on a Wednesday evening in early December. I was still in my van, parked outside a Tim Hortons on the south side of the city, eating a sandwich I'd packed at 5 in the morning and hadn't had time to touch until now. My phone lit up. My mother. She doesn't call midweek, unless something is wrong or unless she's about to ask me to do something she knows I won't want to do. I answered. She asked how I was. I said fine, tired, good kind of tired. She said that was wonderful. Then there was a pause, the kind of pause that has been practiced. She told me Kevin was bringing someone home for the holidays, a woman named Rebecca. They'd been together for about 8 months, which for Kevin was practically an engagement. Rebecca's family was flying in from Vancouver for a dinner at my parents' place the week before Christmas. A big thing, everyone meeting everyone, first impressions, the whole production. I said that sounded lovely. I meant it. I was genuinely glad for him. She said Kevin had asked her to call me. Another pause. He didn't want me there. Not those exact words. My mother doesn't use exact words when she's delivering something uncomfortable. What she said was that Kevin felt the gathering might go more smoothly if it were kept smaller, more intimate. That Rebecca's family had a certain kind of background, and Kevin wanted the evening to feel cohesive. That he'd mentioned, specifically, that he worried I might bring up work and that it could make things awkward. That he'd said, and here she dropped her voice slightly, the way people do when they're quoting something they don't fully agree with but also aren't going to argue against, that my line of work might not go over well with Rebecca's family. I sat in my van and I looked at the parking lot. A woman was wrestling a stroller through the Tim Hortons door. A man was scraping ice off his windshield in the way that Albertans do in December, with a kind of resigned efficiency. So my blue-collar job would embarrass him, I said. I didn't phrase it as a question. My mother said it wasn't about embarrassment, it was about optics. Kevin's word, apparently. I told her I understood. I did understand. I just didn't understand it the way she thought I did. I hung up and sat there long enough that my sandwich got cold. I thought about calling my friend Petra, who would have immediately started drafting a strongly worded text to send to Kevin on my behalf. I thought about calling my dad, who would have sighed and said something like boys will be boys, and I couldn't face that. I thought about calling Kevin directly and asking him, calmly and in plain language, what exactly he thought happened at a job site every day. I didn't call anyone. I finished my sandwich. I drove home. Here's what my family didn't know at that point, because I'd been waiting for the right moment to tell them. 6 weeks earlier, I had been awarded the electrical subcontract for a mixed-use development in Calgary's East Village. 14 stories. Retail on the ground floor, residential above, with a rooftop amenity space that the general contractor kept describing as a statement. The contract value was $2.3 million. It was the largest single contract my company had ever held. It meant I was no longer just a journey person picking up crew work. I had incorporated. I had employees. I had liability insurance and a project manager and a relationship with a materials supplier that I'd spent 2 years building. I'd planned to announce it at Christmas, over my mother's tourtière, which she makes every year, and which is the only thing I've ever been genuinely homesick for. But Kevin had taken that moment from me before I knew it existed, so I decided to let him have his dinner. I was curious what a week would teach everyone. The week before Christmas in Edmonton is not a quiet week. I worked 10-hour days on a light industrial project out near the airport, came home every night and made soup from a package because I didn't have the energy for anything more complicated, and watched one episode of something before falling asleep on my couch. On the actual evening of my parents' dinner, I ordered Thai food, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat on my balcony in my parka because the sky was doing something spectacular with the northern lights, and I wasn't going to miss it just because I was cold. It was one of the quietest evenings I'd had in months. I didn't know what was happening across the city at my parents' house while I was watching the lights. My mother told me most of it later, in a phone call that lasted almost 40 minutes, and during which she cried twice and apologized 4 times. My dad filled in the gaps when I saw him in person. Between the two of them, I got a fairly complete picture. Rebecca's family had driven down from their hotel in a rental SUV. Her parents were pleasant, her mother warm and curious, her father quieter but engaged. And her older brother, a man named Clifton who was visiting from his base in BC, had come along as well. Clifton, it turned out, was a Red Seal electrician, 15 years in the trade. He currently worked as a foreman on large-scale infrastructure projects across Western Canada. He'd spent 3 years on a hydroelectric project in northern BC and had recently completed work on a highway realignment in the interior. He talked about his work the way people talk about something they're proud of, naturally, without apology. Kevin, at some point early in the evening, made a comment. My mother wasn't sure exactly how it came up, but the gist of it was that his family was all very professionally oriented, very driven. He used the word white collar at some point, which she said felt strange even as he was saying it. He mentioned his work in marketing. He mentioned that our father had worked in insurance for 30 years. He mentioned me. He had to, because Rebecca's mother asked directly if he had any siblings. And he said, yes, a sister. She works in the trades. The way he said it. That's what my mother kept coming back to when she described it to me. The way he said it, like he was mentioning a speeding ticket. A minor thing. Something slightly unfortunate. Clifton put his fork down. He asked what trade. Kevin said electrical. Clifton asked if I was licensed. Kevin said he thought so. He wasn't really sure of the details. Clifton asked what kind of work I did. Commercial? Residential? Industrial? Kevin said he honestly didn't know. He said I mostly just worked on sites. Clifton looked at him for a moment. Not with hostility, my mother was clear about that. With the measured, patient expression of someone who is deciding how much to say. He said that electrical was a serious trade. That Red Seal certification meant you'd passed one of the most technically demanding standardized exams in the country. That a woman running her own crew on commercial sites had almost certainly worked harder to get there than most people he'd met in any field, including his own. Rebecca's mother said that sounded impressive. Kevin laughed and said something about how he just didn't know much about that world. Clifton said mildly that it seemed like something worth knowing about since it was his sister's entire career. And then Rebecca, quiet up until this point, watchful in the way that my mother said made her immediately likable, asked why I wasn't at dinner. Kevin said I'd had a prior commitment. Rebecca looked at him. My mother said she didn't say anything, she just looked at him, and somehow that was worse than anything she could have said. My mother, who had been quiet through most of this, told the truth. I don't know why. She said later that it just came out, that Rebecca's direct question had caught her off guard and she hadn't had time to construct a version of events that was more flattering. She said Kevin had asked that I not be invited because he'd worried my job would make the evening feel awkward. The table went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Clifton didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. He said, simply that in his family, the people who worked in the trades were the ones everyone else called when something actually needed to get done. That his father had started as a laborer and put 3 kids through university on a tradesperson's wages. That he personally found more to talk about with a journey-person electrician over coffee than he did with most people at industry dinners. Rebecca reached over and put her hand briefly on Kevin's arm, not affectionately. The way you touch someone when you're deciding something about them. She said she would have liked to meet his sister. The dinner continued. Nobody stormed out. But my mother described the rest of the evening as polite in a way that felt like work, the way conversations feel when everyone is being careful. Kevin called me 4 days later, Christmas Eve. I was at a friend's place for a small gathering, Petra had insisted, and I stepped outside into the cold to take the call. I could hear the tinsel in his voice, that false brightness people put on when they're nervous. He said he'd heard I hadn't been in touch with Mom and Dad. I said I'd been busy. He said he knew, and that he actually wanted to talk to me about the dinner. I said okay. I let him fill the silence. He told me about Clifton, about what he'd said. About how Rebecca had been quiet on the drive back to the hotel and hadn't texted him until the following afternoon, which for her was unusual. He didn't tell me directly that he'd spent 3 days worried about where things stood with her, but I could hear it between every sentence. He said he'd been an idiot. I waited. He said he hadn't really thought about my work, not really. He'd just assumed, and he trailed off here, which I thought was honest of him, because the assumption was so reflexive he couldn't even articulate it. He'd just assumed it was lesser, that it wouldn't translate, that Rebecca's family would see it that way. I told him that maybe next time he could ask me about my work before deciding how other people would receive it. He said that was fair. Then I told him about the contract. I didn't plan to do it on that phone call. But he asked quietly what I'd been working on lately, and it was the first time in recent memory that he'd asked me that question and seemed to actually want the answer, so I told him. The East Village project. 14 stories. Mixed use. $2.3 million. Largest contract my company had ever held. The silence on his end lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. He said, "That's your company?" I said yes. Incorporated 2 years ago. 4 employees now, with 2 more coming on in the new year. He said he didn't know. I said, I know. I said it without anger. There was no point in anger. The information had been available to him for years. He just never thought to ask. We talked for a few more minutes. He apologized again, more cleanly this time, without the self-justification that tends to show up in first apologies. I accepted it. Not because everything was fixed, but because I don't want to carry weight that isn't mine. I do enough heavy lifting at work. My parents came to see me a few days after Christmas. My mother brought a container of leftover tortilla, which I chose to interpret as an act of love even if it arrived a week late and under complicated circumstances. My dad sat at my kitchen table, looked around at my place with the quiet attention of someone seeing it clearly for the first time, and said he was proud of me. I thanked him and told him it would have been nice to hear that before I was excluded from a family gathering, and he nodded and didn't try to talk his way around it, which I respected. My mother cried. I made tea. Some things need to move through before they can settle. I met Rebecca for the first time in late January. Kevin arranged it with the careful diplomacy of someone who understood he was on thin ice and intended to stay still. We met at a cafe on 17th in Calgary while I was down for a site visit, and Rebecca came alone, which I appreciated. She shook my hand like she meant it. We talked for almost 2 hours. She told me about growing up watching her father and Clifton work, about how she'd always been the one who went into the office and sometimes felt strange about that, like she'd taken the easier road even though her parents had never suggested it. I told her about my apprenticeship, about failing one exam and retaking it and what that felt like, about the first time I ran a crew of 5 people and someone looked to me for an answer, and I had to trust that I actually knew what I was talking about. She laughed and said that sounded exactly like her first year managing a client account. Before we left, she told me that Clifton had asked about me. Not in a personal way, he'd asked professionally. He'd been on a site visit in Edmonton in November and had driven past the East Village project on his way through Calgary and recognized the company name on the hoarding from what Kevin had apparently mentioned to Rebecca at some point after the dinner. He wanted to know if I'd be open to a conversation about a potential collaboration on an upcoming project in the interior. I told her to give him my number. Kevin tried to hide me from his table. He worried I'd be the wrong kind of story to tell. But in trying to manage how I was seen, he'd handed the room to exactly the person who would make sure I was seen clearly. And that person had walked me toward a conversation I didn't know I needed to be having. I'm still a Red Seal electrician. I still wear my CSA-approved boots to every site. I still smell like conduit and coffee and long days. And I've learned to stop waiting for the people who love me to ask about my work before I tell them.